She wasn't just cleaning the house, she was sweeping her way into my heart. And when she whispered, "I can clean, or I can get dirty," I knew my life would never feel the same. I remember the first time I truly noticed her. Not in the way one notices a stranger passing by, but in the way your attention lingers, caught by something you don't quite understand. She was moving across the living room with quiet efficiency, a folded cloth in her hand, her posture straight, her steps deliberate. She was, the maid, yes, but that word felt almost insulting the more I studied her. There was a dignity about her presence that the title could never contain. Her hair, dark with a few elegant strands of silver, was pulled back neatly, but not so tightly that it hid the softness in her face. There was something graceful in how she carried herself, like every small action mattered. She didn't rush. She didn't fumble. She placed things carefully, as though giving even the smallest objects a sense of importance. When she greeted me that morning, her smile was polite but restrained, the kind you give to maintain distance. Yet, in her eyes, there was warmth. A warmth that felt personal, even if she didn't mean it that way. It caught me off guard. I found myself studying her more closely than I should have. The slight curve of her lips, the faint trace of tiredness beneath her eyes, the way her fingers lingered a moment longer on the edge of a polished table, almost as if touch was its own language. She must have sensed my gaze, because when our eyes met, she tilted her head, as if asking silently, "Why are you looking at me like that?" And I had no answer. I should have looked away. I should have reminded myself of the unspoken boundaries between us, her role, my role, the silent line that society would insist we keep. But instead, I smiled faintly, a little embarrassed, a little guilty, and said something about how neatly she worked. Her response was quick, almost practiced. "It's my job," she said with a small shrug, as though dismissing her own efforts. But the way she adjusted the vase on the counter right after, carefully aligning it until it felt just right, told me that it wasn't just a job for her. It was pride. It was presence. It was her way of showing care without ever saying the words. And in that moment, I realized something dangerous. I wasn't drawn to what she did. I was drawn to who she was. The air between us held a quiet weight, unspoken but undeniable. Respectful. Distant. Yet filled with something that felt like the first flicker of a flame. The days that followed settled into a rhythm. I would pass her in the hallway, hear the soft hum of her footsteps in the kitchen, catch the faint scent of lavender when she brushed past carrying fresh linens. We spoke little at first. Just the expected exchanges. "Good morning. Do you need anything?" "No, thank you." Words that belonged to the surface of things, safe and predictable. Yet every time she spoke, I noticed the care in her tone, measured, calm, as if even the simplest phrase deserved attention. One afternoon, I found myself sitting at the dining table, papers scattered around me, while she dusted the shelf nearby. For a while, silence stretched between us, the kind that feels heavy enough to make you aware of your own breathing. I thought about saying something, anything, to break it. And then, almost without thinking, I asked if she liked working here. She paused mid-motion, the cloth resting against the wood for a second too long. When she finally answered, her voice carried a softness I hadn't heard before. "It's steady," she said. "Not unhappy, not joyful. Just steady." There was a truth in that word that pulled at me. Steady, like someone who had weathered storms but still managed to keep walking. As she spoke, she turned slightly, and for the first time, she let me see something beyond her professional mask. A small, almost wistful smile touched her lips, and it made me realize how rare it must be for her to share even that much. When she moved to hand me a glass of water a little later, our hands brushed. A fleeting touch, nothing deliberate. But in that second, I felt the warmth of her skin, the light tremor in her fingers as they passed over mine. She didn't withdraw sharply, she let the moment hang, just long enough to blur the lines of politeness. I don't know if she meant to. Perhaps it was an accident, perhaps not. But I felt it. And I knew she did too, because when I glanced up, her eyes darted away quickly, as if caught in a thought she shouldn't be having. The silence that followed was no longer empty. It was charged, alive with a question neither of us dared to ask. That night, lying awake, I found myself replaying that touch over and over, wondering why something so small could feel so impossibly significant. And I couldn't shake the thought, maybe she was wondering the same. It was late afternoon when it happened, the kind of hour where sunlight slants low through the windows, painting the room in gold and shadow. I was sitting in the lounge, half distracted with a book I wasn't really reading, when she walked in with a basket of freshly pressed clothes. There was something different about her that day. Maybe it was the looseness of her hair, a few strands falling from their usual neat arrangement. Maybe it was the hint of color on her cheeks, as though the warmth of the sun had lingered on her skin. Or maybe it was the way she looked at me, steady, unflinching, as though daring me to notice her not just as a maid, but as a woman. She placed the basket down, smoothing the folded fabric with a hand that lingered longer than necessary. The silence stretched, thick with something unspoken. And then, she turned to me with a small, mischievous smile. "I can clean," she said lightly, her voice carrying a softness that made the words feel heavier than they should. She paused, eyes locking on mine, and then added, almost in a whisper, "Or I can get dirty." The air stilled. For a second, I wasn't sure I'd heard her right. The line was playful, yes, but it was also layered, like a test wrapped in a joke. Did she mean it literally, teasing about her work? Or was she daring me to hear the truth buried beneath? Her expression gave nothing away, except for the faintest flicker in her eyes, a spark of vulnerability hiding behind her smile. She was watching me, carefully, as if my reaction would decide whether her words would vanish as harmless banter or linger as a dangerous confession. I laughed softly, more out of nervousness than amusement, and said something clumsy about her sense of humor. But inside, my pulse had quickened. Her words echoed in my mind, louder than any joke should. For the rest of that evening, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The way her voice dipped slightly on the last phrase, the way her gaze didn't flinch, the way her hands folded neatly in front of her as if to steady herself after daring to cross a line. It was nothing. It was everything. A single sentence that shifted the ground beneath us. And I knew, with a certainty that unsettled me, that we were no longer just circling polite boundaries. We were stepping into dangerous, uncharted territory, a place where glances carried weight and words carried fire. That evening, the house was quiet. A storm had passed earlier, leaving the air cool and heavy with the scent of rain. I found her in the kitchen, standing by the sink, her sleeves rolled up as she dried her hands on a faded towel. She was humming softly to herself, almost absent-mindedly, the kind of sound people make when they think no one is listening. I lingered in the doorway for a moment, watching her. There was something disarming about her in that light, not the efficient, composed woman I usually saw, but someone softer, almost fragile. When she noticed me, she stopped humming, lowering her eyes with a smile that felt practiced. "You work too late," I said gently, stepping further into the room. She gave a small shrug, turning back to the counter. "There's always something to be done." Her voice was calm, but I could hear the weariness tucked inside it, like a thread pulled too tight. I leaned against the frame, hesitating before I spoke again. "Earlier, what you said." Her hands froze. For a moment, she didn't move, as though the memory of her own words had turned her to stone. Slowly, she placed the towel down and faced me, her eyes searching mine. "It was just a joke," she said softly, but her tone betrayed her. There was no laughter in it. No lightness. Only hesitation. I shook my head. It didn't sound like a joke. Her lips parted, then closed again. She looked away, toward the window streaked with rain, and when she spoke, her voice carried a fragile honesty I hadn't heard before. "Sometimes," she whispered, "it's easier to hide behind words like that. To say something reckless, then laugh it away, instead of admitting what you really want." The room grew still. I felt the weight of her confession press between us, delicate yet undeniable. "And what do you really want?" I asked, my voice quieter now, almost afraid of the answer. She turned back to me then, and for the first time, she didn't look like she was trying to be the composed maid, or the careful woman. She looked human. Vulnerable. Her eyes held both fear and longing, a war she'd been fighting in silence. "I don't know," she admitted, shaking her head slightly. "But I know I can't stop thinking about how wrong this feels, and how much I wish it didn't." Her honesty struck me like a storm breaking over still water. And in that fragile, unguarded moment, I realized we were standing on the edge of something neither of us could pretend away anymore. The storm rolled in with a suddenness that startled the house itself. Rain battered the windows, wind howled through the cracks, and the lights flickered in uneasy rhythms. I was sitting in the dim glow of the living room lamp when I heard her footsteps approach. She carried a folded blanket in her arms, her expression calm, though I could see the faint tension in her shoulders. "Thought you might need this," she said softly, placing the blanket on the armrest beside me. Her voice was steady, but there was something in her eyes, a quiet unease that betrayed the storm had unsettled her more than she cared to admit. The lights flickered again, this time longer, and she flinched. Just slightly. Barely enough to notice, but I did. Her hand brushed against the wall, fingers searching for balance. Instinctively, I stood and stepped toward her. My hand found her arm before I could think, warm, firm, steadying. For a moment, she froze beneath my touch, as though weighing whether to step back or lean in. Then, almost imperceptibly, she allowed her weight to rest against me. Her arm was slender but strong under my fingers. I felt the faint tremor of her muscles, the uneven rhythm of her breath. And then something shifted, her cheek turned just enough that I caught the scent of her hair, rain and lavender mingling together, a fragrance so soft it seemed to belong to the moment itself. Neither of us spoke. Words would have broken the fragile truth unfolding between us. Instead, I tightened my hold just slightly, a silent reassurance that she wasn't alone. She didn't resist. If anything, she leaned in closer, the top of her head brushing lightly against my chest. It wasn't long, perhaps only a handful of seconds, but in that stillness, the storm outside faded. The pounding of rain, the growl of thunder, all of it dulled beneath the sound of her breathing, the closeness of her body, the warmth radiating from her presence. When the light steadied again, she pulled back gently, her hand brushing down her sleeve as if to erase the evidence of our closeness. Her eyes lifted to mine, uncertain but not ashamed. There was gratitude in them, yes, but something more. Something that trembled at the edge of confession. I didn't press her. I simply nodded, offering the kind of quiet acknowledgement that words could never hold. And in that shared silence, I understood, this was no longer just circumstance. This was a choice, one we had both begun to make, even without saying it aloud. The next morning, the house felt different. The storm had passed, leaving everything washed and still, but between us, something heavier lingered. She moved through her chores briskly, avoiding my eyes, her footsteps quicker than usual, her gestures sharper. It was as if she was trying to erase the memory of the night before, to scrub away the warmth we had shared as though it were nothing more than dust on the furniture. I watched her for a long while, hoping she would glance my way, but she never did. Finally, I couldn't take the distance anymore. "Are you going to pretend last night didn't happen?" I asked gently. Her hand stilled on the counter. She drew a quiet breath before answering, still without looking at me. "It shouldn't have happened." I stepped closer. But it did. This time she turned, and the look in her eyes was fierce, not angry, but desperate. "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling against her control. "I can't afford to forget who I am. To you, she hesitated, as though the words themselves burned, "I'm just the maid. Nothing more." Her words cut deeper than I expected. "No," I said quickly, shaking my head. "That's not true." That's not who you are to me. She pressed her lips together, fighting something inside her. Maybe not to you. But to the world. To everyone else. That's all I'll ever be. And if anyone even suspected, she stopped herself, turning away as though the thought was too heavy to finish. I felt the ache of her struggle, the invisible chains she carried. She wasn't just fighting me, she was fighting years of being defined by a role, of believing she wasn't allowed to want more. Why does it matter what the world thinks? I asked quietly. She laughed once, a sharp, pained sound. Because the world doesn't forgive women like me. Not for mistakes. Not for feelings. The silence between us crackled, heavier than thunder. I wanted to reach for her, to make her see what I saw, her dignity, her strength, her beauty. But she stepped back, putting distance between us with deliberate finality. You're young, she whispered. You'll forget me soon enough. Her words struck like cold rain. And yet, in her eyes, I caught the betrayal of her own lie, the longing she couldn't quite bury, the truth she couldn't quite silence. She turned away then, back to her work, her shoulders tight. But I knew, we both knew, the war between us was far from over. The day dragged on in heavy quiet. I went through the motions of my work, but my mind never left her. Every time I passed a room, I caught a glimpse of her, folding, straightening, polishing, movements precise, as if she were determined to vanish behind her tasks. Yet I could feel the weight of last night still alive between us, pressing against the air, making it harder to breathe. By evening, I found her sitting alone in the small sunroom at the back of the house. The light had dimmed to a soft amber, shadows stretching across the tiled floor. She wasn't working. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers knotted together, her posture just slightly slouched. For the first time, she looked less like the careful, composed woman I'd come to know, and more like someone simply tired. Tired of hiding. Tired of being strong. I hesitated in the doorway, wondering if I should leave her with her thoughts. But something in the curve of her shoulders pulled me forward. Quietly, I stepped inside and sat down beside her. Neither of us spoke at first. The silence was long, but it didn't feel empty. It was the kind of silence where hearts did the talking, where closeness carried its own meaning. I let the moment stretch, breathing in the faint scent of her, lavender and soap, threaded with something softer, something purely her. Finally, I reached out. Slowly, carefully, as if testing a fragile glass, I laid my hand over hers. Her fingers were cool at first, still knotted tightly together. For a moment, she didn't move. I thought she might pull away. But then, with a soft, almost trembling exhale, her hand relaxed beneath mine. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, barely above a whisper. Maybe I don't just want to clean anymore. The words fell between us like a secret she had been carrying for years. Not loud, not dramatic, just honest. Honest in a way that stripped her of every defense. I turned to her, and in the dim light, her eyes met mine. No shields. No practiced smiles. Just truth. I saw the fear there, yes, but I also saw something else, hope. A flickering, delicate flame of hope. I don't see you as just that, I said, my own voice unsteady. I never did. Something softened in her face. She looked at me as if hearing those words was both a comfort and a danger. Then, slowly, she leaned in, not much, just enough that her shoulder brushed against mine. I shifted closer, letting our bodies rest together in quiet alignment. The warmth of her presence seeped into me, calming and electric all at once. When I lifted my arm, she allowed it, resting lightly against me, her head finding its place against my chest. Her heartbeat was steady, and yet I could feel the hesitation in the way she clung, like someone stepping into forbidden waters, unsure if she should keep swimming or turn back. I held her tighter, not to trap her, but to promise her safety in the choice she had already made. We didn't kiss. We didn't need to. The intimacy was in the silence, in the steady rise and fall of her breath against me, in the warmth of her hand resting open beneath mine. Outside, the night deepened, but inside, the world grew still, a stillness that felt like the beginning of something neither of us had the courage to name, but both of us already understood. And in that fragile, perfect moment, we chose closeness over fear.